Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who saves them all. Sometimes being different isn't weakness. It's your greatest strength. In the village of Vargheim, Astrid was seen as too weak to be a Viking's bride. She walked with a limp, spoke softly, and spent her days healing instead of fighting. Even her warrior husband Eirik kept his distance from this gentle woman. But when raiders attacked while the warriors were away, they made a mistake. They thought they faced only children, elders, and one limping healer. They didn't know Astrid had studied the old war stories and knew every path through the mountains. They didn't know that quiet people often see what loud ones miss. What happened next would change how the entire village saw strength forever. How could one woman they called weak defend against an army of raiders? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Vargheim's wooden walkways, painting the fjord-side village in hues of gold and amber. Astrid moved carefully along the familiar path, a leather healing pouch bouncing gently against her hip with each uneven step. The limp that marked her gait had become as much a part of the village rhythm as the lapping of waves against the rocky shore. She paused at the well in the village center, drawing water with practiced efficiency, despite the way her left leg dragged slightly behind. The other women had long since finished their morning tasks and retreated to their hearths. But Astrid's work began when others ended. Sickness and injury kept no schedule. Still tending to old Magnus's fever? Sigurd's voice carried across the square, tinged with the familiar note of barely concealed disdain. The blacksmith's wife stood in her doorway, arms crossed, watching Astrid's slow progress with calculating eyes. "The fever broke yesterday," Astrid replied quietly, adjusting a grip on the water bucket, "but his lungs still rattle. The willow bark tea helps." Sigurd's expression suggested she found little value in such gentle remedies. A good bloodletting would serve him better. Clear out the bad humors. Astrid said nothing, having learned long ago that arguing with Sigrid only provided more ammunition for the woman's sharp tongue. Instead, she continued toward Magnus's longhouse, her steps measured and deliberate. Behind her, she could hear Sigrid muttering to her neighbor about newfangled healing methods and wives who didn't know their proper place. The marriage ceremony had taken place 3 moons ago, when the autumn leaves turned the color of fire and the warriors prepared for their final raids before winter. Astrid remembers standing beside Eirik in the sacred grove, both of them stiff as carved wooden statues. While elderborn spoke the ancient words that bound their lives together, the ceremonial marriage blade Eirik's finest sword had gleamed in the torchlight as he placed it symbolically at her feet, the traditional gesture of a warrior offering his protection to his bride. But when Astrid had reached down to lift the blade in acceptance, her hand had trembled slightly, and she'd nearly dropped the heavy weapon. The gathered villagers had exchanged glances, and she'd seen the doubt creep into their eyes like morning fog. Even now, the sword hung on the wall of their shared longhouse, untouched since that night. Eirik had said nothing about her clumsiness, but he'd moved the blade high enough that she wouldn't accidentally knock it down during her daily tasks. A kindness, perhaps, or simply practical thinking. Their living arrangements reflected the awkwardness of their union. Eirik slept on his side of the great room, she on hers, with the cold hearth between them like a stone wall. They spoke when necessary about meals, about village matters, about the practical details of sharing a home. But their conversations never strayed beyond the boundaries of politeness. Astrid understood his hesitation. She'd seen how the other warriors looked at their wives, women who could skin a deer as quickly as they could weave wool, who stood tall and proud beside their men, who bore children with the stoic strength their harsh land demanded. She was none of these things, and everyone knew it. But knowledge was its own kind of strength. even if others couldn't see it. While the village women gossiped and sewed, Astrid had spent her childhood listening to Elder Bjorn's stories of ancient battles and forgotten heroes. Her fever-weakened legs had kept her from running with the other children, but her mind had soaked up every tale of strategy and survival. She knew the story of Ingvar the Wise, who defeated a superior force by redirecting a mountain stream to flood his enemy's camp. She could recite the tale of Freydi's shield maiden, who'd use smoke and mirrors to make her small band appear like a vast army. Most importantly, she knew the land around Vargheim as well as any hunter, every hidden path, every cave, every place where the terrain might favor the clever over the strong. "Good morning, Magnus," she called softly as she pushed open his door. The old fisherman sat hunched by his fire, coughing into a rough cloth. His wife, Gerda, looked up from her mending with grateful eyes. "Ah, young healer," Magnus wheezed, attempting a smile. "Come to dose me with more of your bitter tea?" "The bitterness means it's working," Astrid replied, settling beside him with her supplies. She mixed the willow bark with honey and hot water, adding a pinch of dried mint to make it more palatable. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in days. The rattling in my chest is quieter." As Astrid worked, mixing her remedies and checking Magnus's temperature with the back of her hand, she was aware of Gerda watching her with the same expression she'd seen on many faces, a mixture of gratitude and puzzlement. They appreciated her skills but couldn't quite understand how someone so young and seemingly fragile had acquired such knowledge. The truth was simpler than they imagined. When other children were learning to fight and hunt, Astrid had been learning to observe. Fever had taught her to read the subtle signs of sickness in a person's face. Her enforced stillness had sharpened her ability to notice details others missed. Her quiet nature meant people spoke freely around her, sharing information they might have guarded more carefully with others. She finished tending to Magnus and made her way through the village, stopping at 3 other homes where her services were needed. Young Olaf had scraped his knee badly during sword practice, and his mother fretted over the wound turning black. Elder Bjorn's arthritis pained him more with each passing day, and he welcomed her gentle massages and warming salves. At each stop, Astrid heard fragments of conversation that painted a picture of village life she doubted even Eirik fully understood. The fishermen worried about strange currents in the fjord that might signal approaching storms. The mothers whispered about food stores running lower than usual, thanks to a poor harvest. The elders spoke in hushed tones about raids from neighboring clans becoming more frequent and more violent. Most telling of all, she noticed things others overlooked, the way certain men avoided looking toward the mountain passes when they thought no one was watching. The nervous glances exchanged when strangers appeared in the village. The subtle increase in the number of weapons being sharpened and repaired. By midday, she was making her way home when she encountered Eirik returning from his training session with the other young warriors. Sweat darkened his fair hair, and his practice sword hung at his side, well used and comfortable in his grip. He was everything the villagers expected in a warrior: tall, strong, quick with blade and fist. "Good day," he said formally, nodding, as they met outside their longhouse. "Good day," she replied, equally formal. They stood for a moment in uncomfortable silence, like strangers sharing a path rather than husband and wife sharing a home. "I'll be departing tomorrow," he said finally. "Winter hunt in the high valleys. We'll be gone for several days." Astrid nodded, unsurprised. The winter hunts were tradition, a last chance to bring in meat before the snows made travel impossible. "I'll prepare supplies for your journey." "That's not necessary," Eirik said quickly, then caught himself. "I mean, thank you, but the other men's wives are handling the preparations." Another small reminder that she wasn't quite like the other wives, that her contributions weren't expected or perhaps even wanted. Astrid simply nodded again and stepped aside to let him pass. But as she watched him enter their home, She found herself thinking not about the awkwardness between them, but about the timing of the hunt. Winter hunts usually took place later in the season, when the animals had descended from the highest peaks. This felt early, almost rushed, as if the warriors were eager to be gone from the village for reasons that had nothing to do with hunting. That evening, as she prepared their simple meal, Astrid listened to Eirik moving about their shared space. He gathered his weapons with unusual care, checked and rechecked his supplies, and spent long minutes standing at the window, looking out toward the fjord. "Is there something troubling you?" she asked finally, setting a bowl of stew before him. He looked startled, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "No, nothing you need concern yourself with." But his hand rested on the hilt of his knife as he spoke, and his eyes kept drifting toward the door. Astrid said nothing more, but she made mental note of his behavior. In her experience, when warriors grew nervous without obvious cause, it usually meant they knew something the rest of the village didn't. That night, as they lay in their separate sleeping areas, Astrid stared up at the rough wooden beams and thought about patterns, the subtle signs and small details that most people dismissed, but that could reveal larger truths to those who knew how to read them. The rushed hunt, the nervous energy among the fighting men, the whispered concerns about strangers and raids. Something was coming to Vargheim, something that had the warriors eager to be elsewhere when it arrived. Whether they were running from trouble or positioning themselves to meet it, Astrid couldn't yet say. But she was certain that tomorrow's departure was about more than hunting. Deer in the mountains. She reached up to touch her healing pouch, feeling the familiar comfort of the worn leather and the dried herbs within. Whatever was coming, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had seen her through fever, through the doubts of her neighbors, and through the loneliness of a marriage that felt more like a treaty between strangers. The marriage blade gleamed in the dim firelight, hanging on the wall between them like a promise neither had learned how to keep. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the longhouse windows. Astrid woke to the sound of men's voices outside, the hunting party gathering in the village square, their breath visible in white puffs as they checked weapons and supplies one final time. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to see Eirik adjusting the straps on his pack. In the pale morning light, he looked older than his 26 years, his jaw set with the kind of determination she'd seen in warriors preparing for battle rather than hunt. "Safe travels," she said quietly, offering him a small bundle wrapped in cloth, dried meat and honey cakes. "They'll keep well." For a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "Thank you," he said, tucking the bundle into his pack. Then, more formally, "Keep yourself safe while we're gone." The words held more weight than a simple farewell should carry. Astrid nodded, watching as he joined the other men. Elder Bjorn stood apart from the hunting party, his weathered face creased with concern, and she noticed how the old man's eyes followed the warriors with the intensity of someone watching the last defense walk away. Within an hour, the hunting party had disappeared into the mountain passes, leaving Vargheim feeling strangely hollow. The women went about their morning tasks with unusual quiet, and even the children played their games closer to home than usual. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath. Astrid spent the morning tending to her usual patients, but everywhere she went, she sensed an underlying tension. Conversations stopped when she approached, resumed when she moved away. People glanced frequently toward the fjord and the mountain paths, as if expecting to see something that hadn't yet appeared. It was nearly midday when the warning horn shattered the village quiet. The sound came from the eastern watchtower, 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones. Astrid had never heard that particular sequence before, but she knew from the way people froze in place that it meant danger. Real danger. She was helping old Gerda repair a torn fishing net when the horn sounded. Both women looked up sharply, and Gerda's face went pale. "That's the signal for armed men approaching," Gerda whispered. "More than our own returning." Before Astrid could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the eastern path. A figure stumbled into view, a young man she recognized as Canute, one of the village's scouts. Blood streaked his face and soaked his torn shirt, and he could barely stay upright as he staggered toward the village center. Astrid dropped the net and hurried toward him, her healer's instincts overriding everything else. But even as she moved, she could see the crowd gathering around the wounded scout, and she heard the words that would change everything. "Grimner's men," Canute gasped, swaying on his feet. 2 days behind me. Maybe less. 40 warriors, maybe. More. The name sent a chill through the assembled villagers. Grimner Iron Fist was known throughout the region as a raider without mercy, a man who took what he wanted and burned what he couldn't carry. His clan had grown powerful by absorbing smaller groups, either through conquest or by offering protection that came at a price too high for most to pay. "How many?" Elder Bjorn demanded, pushing through the crowd to reach the scout. "Too many," Canute replied, then collapsed to his knees. "They're not just raiding, they're coming to stay. I heard them talking around their fires. They want Vargheim for a permanent base." Astrid reached the scout as he fell forward, catching him before he could hit the ground. His injuries were severe sword cuts on his arms and a deep gash across his ribs that spoke of a fighting retreat. But it was the arrow wound in his shoulder that worried her most. The shaft broken off, but the head still buried deep. "Get him to my longhouse," she ordered, and surprisingly, several men moved to help without question. As they carried Canute away from the crowd, Astrid could hear the panic beginning to build behind them. "Where are our warriors?" 2 days into the mountains at least. "We can't recall them in time. We have to run. Take what we can and flee to the western settlements." As Astrid worked to clean and bind Canute's wounds, she listened to the debate raging outside. The voices grew more desperate with each passing minute, and she could hear Elder Bjorn trying to maintain order while others argued for immediate evacuation. "The paths west will be watched," Canute said weakly, gripping her arm as she extracted the arrowhead from his shoulder. "They have scouts everywhere. That's how they found me so quickly when I tried to circle around." "Rest now," Astrid murmured, giving him a draught of willow bark tea mixed with poppy extract to dull his pain. "You've done well to bring us warning." But as Canute drifted into an uneasy sleep, Astrid found herself staring out the window at the village she'd called home for 3 moons. Vargheim was built for beauty and comfort, not defense. The longhouses spread out along the fjord's edge in a pattern that made the most of the morning sun and the fishing access, but offered no protection against a determined attack. The palisade around the village was more symbolic than functional, high enough to keep out wolves and bears, but nothing that would stop armed men for more than a few minutes. There were perhaps 15 men past their prime left in the village. A dozen women and 20 children ranging from toddlers to boys, just old enough to hold a practice sword. Against 40 seasoned raiders, it would be a massacre. Astrid stepped outside to find the village in chaos. Families were already packing what they could carry, loading carts and bundles with their most precious possessions. Children cried as their mothers hurried them along, and the older men argued in tight clusters about which escape route offered the best chance of survival. "We can't all travel together," Sigurd was saying, her usual sharp composure cracking under pressure. "Too slow, too visible. We need to split into smaller groups." "And if Grimner's scouts are already watching the paths?" Elder Bjorn countered. "We'll be picked off one group at a time." "Then, what you suggest, old man, that we sit here and wait for them to arrive?" Astrid moved through the crowd quietly, listening to the arguments and watching the preparations. Her mind was working through possibilities the way it always did when faced with a difficult healing, examining symptoms, considering treatments. looking for the approach that might seem impossible, but could actually work. What about the caves? Young Olaf suggested, his voice barely carrying over the adult conversations. His mother hushed him quickly, but Astrid had heard. The caves. She knew them well, a network of natural caverns in the cliffs above the village, connected by passages that were treacherous if you didn't know them, but could provide perfect hiding places for those who did. She'd explored them extensively during her childhood convalescence, mapping their twists and turns when she was 2. Weak for more active pursuits. But hiding wasn't survival, especially not with winter coming. Even if they could evade Grimner's men for a few days or weeks, they would eventually be found or forced out by cold and hunger. "Listen to me," she said, stepping forward into the center of the debate. Her voice wasn't loud, but something in. Her tone made the others pause and turn toward her. "I know those caves Olaf mentioned," she continued, "but hiding won't save us. If Grimner wants Vargheim as a permanent base, he won't give up after a few days of searching. He'll wait us out or burn us out, and winter will do the rest." "Then what do you propose, girl?" Sigrid demanded. "You think we should fight them? Look around you. We have no warriors, no weapons worth the name." Astrid looked around at the faces, watching her frightened, desperate, already resigned to loss. These were her people now, whether they fully accepted her or not, and she was tired of being seen as too weak to matter. "Yes," she said simply. "I think we should fight." The silence that followed her words was broken only by the sound of wind off the fjord and the distant cry of gulls. Then the arguments erupted again, louder and more frantic than before. But Astrid was no longer listening to the voices of panic. Instead, she was remembering tales of impossible victories won by those who understood that true strength sometimes wore the mask of weakness, and that the greatest battles were often won before the first sword was drawn. The arguments continued for nearly an hour, before Elder Bjorn finally called for silence with a sharp rap of his walking stick against the stone well. The old man's authority still carried weight. In Vargheim, even in times of crisis. "Enough," he said, his weathered voice cutting through the chaos. "We're accomplishing nothing with this panic. Young Astrid has made a proposal. Before we dismiss it entirely, perhaps we should hear her reasoning." Astrid felt the weight of every gaze in the village center. Some faces showed skepticism, others outright disbelief. But a few, notably young Olaf and his mother Runa, plus a handful of the older men, watched her with something that might have been hope. "You all know the stories as well as I do," she began, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Harold the Cunning, who defeated King Eirik's army with nothing but fishermen and farmers. Sigrid the Wise, who held Hiddeby against Danish raiders for 3 weeks until help arrived. They didn't win through strength of arms alone. Those are stories," Sigrid interrupted. "Tales told around winter fires to entertain children. Based on real events," Elder Bjorn said quietly. "I knew Harold's grandson. The old tactics still work, if you have the courage to try them." Astrid nodded gratefully toward the elder, then continued. "Grimner expects to find a defenseless village or fleeing refugees. He's not expecting resistance from those he considers beneath his notice. That gives us an advantage." She moved to the center of the circle, drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "Our greatest weakness isn't our lack of warriors. It's that we're thinking like victims instead of defenders. But look at what we actually have." Her stick traced the outline of Vargheim's layout. The village sits on high ground above the fjord, with clear sight lines in 3 directions. The only practical approach for a large force is from the east, through the pass where Canute encountered them. "That's also our only escape route," pointed out Eirik the Elder, Magnus's brother. "If we commit to defending, we trap ourselves." "Only if we think like warriors," Astrid replied. "But what if we think like hunters instead, or fishermen?" What if we make them come to us on our terms? She began sketching additional lines in the dirt. The network of animal paths that wound through the hills. The seasonal streams that could be redirected. The hidden approaches known only to locals who'd spent their lives hunting and foraging in these lands. I don't understand, Runa said, though she was leaning forward with interest. How do we make 40 warriors fight on our terms? Astrid looked up from her rough map, and for the first time since the crisis began, she smiled. The same way we handle a difficult birth or a spreading fever. We don't attack the problem directly. We change the conditions until the problem solves itself. She had their attention now, even from the skeptics. In the margins of the crowd, she could see some of the older women nodding thoughtfully. They understood the principle, even if they couldn't yet see the application. 40 warriors, she continued, need food, water, shelter, and clear ground to fight effectively. What if we make sure they can't find any of those things easily? Her stick moved across the dirt map again, marking specific locations. The stream that feeds their most likely camping spot can be fouled with bitter herbs, not poisoned, but made undrinkable. The clear ground of our main square can be turned into a maze of obstacles. The stored grain and preserved meat can be hidden or moved. And when they become frustrated and angry, Eirik asked, angry raiders are more dangerous, not less. Angry fighters make mistakes, Elder Bjorn said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. They stop thinking tactically and start reacting emotionally. Exactly. Astrid stood, brushing dirt from her hands. But more importantly, 40 warriors can only fight effectively if they can use their numbers and training. What if we make it impossible for them to do either? She gestured toward the hills surrounding the village. These lands are full of narrow paths, hidden clearings, and natural bottlenecks. Places where numbers become a disadvantage rather than a strength. Places where local knowledge matters more than sword skill. Young Olaf raised his hand tentatively. You want us to lure them into the hills? But they'll just burn the village once they realize what we're doing. Let them, Astrid sighed, surprising everyone, including herself with the certainty in her voice. Buildings can be rebuilt. People cannot be brought back from the dead. If we save lives, we save everything that truly matters. The silence that followed was different from before, thoughtful rather than shocked. She could see people beginning to consider her words seriously, weighing them against their own knowledge of the local terrain and their memories of the old stories. What would you need? Elder Bjorn asked finally. If we were to attempt such a defense, what resources would be required? Astrid felt a surge of gratitude toward the old man for taking her proposal seriously. Everyone who can walk and follow. Instructions. The children would actually be valuable. They know hiding places adults can't fit into, and they can move quietly through the underbrush. She began counting on her fingers. We'd need rope, oil for fires, every tool that could serve as a weapon, and most importantly, we'd need the saga scrolls. The scrolls? Sigrid frowned. What use are old stories in a fight? They contain detailed accounts of tactics that worked for our ancestors, Astrid explained. Specific techniques for small forces defeating larger ones. I've memorized many of them, but having the originals would let us reference details we might need. Elder Bjorn was already nodding. I know where they're kept. They're yours if you need them. What else? Time to prepare, and people willing to trust that sometimes the weakest-looking approach is actually the strongest. She looked around the circle one more time, meeting as many eyes as she could. I won't lie to you. This will be dangerous. Some of us might not survive, but running guarantees that none of us will survive as free people, and fighting conventionally guarantees we'll all die quickly. How long do we have? Runa asked. If Canute was right about their pace, perhaps a day. And a half. Maybe less if they push hard. The weight of that timeline settled over the group like a physical thing. A day and a half to transform from helpless victims into effective defenders. It seemed impossible. "I need to know now," Astrid said quietly. "Are we going to try this, or should we resume planning our evacuation?" "Either choice is valid, bud." "We can't do both." Elderborn looked around the circle, reading faces with the skill of someone who'd been settling village disputes for decades. All in favor of Astrid's plan? Hands rose slowly, first Bjorn's own, then Olaf's, followed by his mother Runa. Eirik the elder hesitated, then raised his hand as well. One by one, others followed, until only a handful remained uncommitted. Even Sigrid, after a long moment of internal struggle, raised her hand. "I think you're all mad," she said, "but I'd rather die fighting than die running." Astrid felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in her life, people were looking to her for leadership, trusting her judgment despite her perceived weaknesses. "Then we begin now," she said, moving toward Elder Born's longhouse, where the saga scrolls were kept. "And we begin with learning how our ancestors turned defeat into victory." The saga scrolls lay spread across Elder Born's great table like battle plans drawn by the gods themselves. Astrid's fingers traced the faded ink as she read aloud the account of Thorvald the Clever, who had defended his coastal settlement against Danish raiders by creating false paths that led invaders into carefully prepared ambushes. Here, she sighed, pointing to a detailed description. Thorvald used bundles of dry brush soaked in fish oil to create walls of fire that could be lit quickly. The fires didn't just block paths. They created smoke that confused the attackers and hid the movements of defenders. Around the table, the village's senior members leaned in to study the ancient tactics. Magnus, despite his lingering cough, had insisted on joining the planning session. Sigrid sat beside Eirik the Elder, her earlier skepticism replaced by grim determination. Even young Olaf was present, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "The forge hammer," Sigrid said suddenly, understanding dawning in her voice. "My husband's tools. We could use them to bend iron into spikes, create obstacles that would funnel the raiders where we want them to go." Astrid nodded eagerly. "Exactly. We're not trying to stop them entirely. We're trying to control where they can move and how they can fight." She turned to another scroll, this one describing how Freydis the Bold had used the natural acoustics of a mountain valley to make her small war party sound like a much larger force. "Sound carries differently in our hills," she mused. "If we position people correctly, we could make 40 defenders sound like 400. Or make 40 attackers sound like they're everywhere at once," Elder Born added thoughtfully. "Confusion works both ways." They worked through the afternoon, extracting tactical details from stories Astrid had heard as entertainment but now read as instruction manuals. Each saga offered techniques that could be adapted to their situation, ways to multiply their apparent numbers, methods for turning familiar terrain into deadly obstacles, strategies for making a small force seem larger and more threatening than it actually was. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Astrid stood and stretched, her aching back. "We have the knowledge," she said. "Now we need to apply it." "Sigrid, how quickly can the forge be put to work?" "My husband left detailed notes about the smithing techniques," Sigrid replied. "I can work the bellows and heat the metal. With help, we could have spikes and caltrops ready by morning." "Good. Magnus, despite your illness, you know our waters better than anyone. Can the stream be diverted or fouled without making it obvious?" Magnus nodded slowly. "There's a beaver dam upstream that's been causing problems for months. If we break it in the right way, we could flood their most likely campsite and force them to choose higher ground we can better control." "Excellent. Olaf, I need you to gather the other young ones. They'll be our scouts and messengers." Fast, quiet, and small enough to hide where adults cannot. The boy straightened with pride at being given such an important role. How many should I bring? All of them who can follow orders and keep silent when needed. Age doesn't matter as much as reliability. As the group began to disperse to their assigned tasks, Elder Bjorn lingered beside the scrolls. You realize, he said quietly, that even if we succeed in the first confrontation, Grimner won't simply give up and leave. Raiders like him don't accept defeat gracefully. Astrid had been thinking the same thing. One battle at a time, she replied. If we can survive the initial attack and inflict enough losses, we might convince him that Vargheim isn't worth the cost. Raiders prefer easy conquests. And if we can't convince him? She met the old man's eyes steadily. Then we keep fighting until our warriors return, or until there's no one left to fight. The gravity of that statement hung between them for a firmness. Moment before Bjorn nodded. I've lived long enough to see many changes, he said. I never expected to see Eirik's quiet wife become a war leader, but I'm grateful for it. As evening approached, Astrid made her way through the village, checking on the preparations and trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. At the forge, Sigrid worked with grim efficiency, her strong arms pumping the bellows while heated iron glowed orange in the coals. The sharp smell of hot metal and coal smoke filled the air. How many can you make? Astrid asked, watching as Sigrid shaped a piece of iron into a wicked-looking spike. Perhaps 50 by dawn, if I work through the night, Sigrid replied, without looking up from her work. Enough to block several pathways or create a defensive perimeter on key positions. Near the stream, Magnus directed the controlled destruction of the beaver dam. The work was delicate. They needed to create flooding that looked natural while ensuring the water would flow where they needed it to go. Too obvious, and the raiders would realize they were walking into prepared defenses. Too subtle, and the diversion wouldn't be effective. In the village center, mothers worked alongside their older children to prepare bundles of brush and gather containers of oil. The materials for creating fire barriers were simple enough, but placing them effectively would require careful coordination. Young Olaf had assembled his group of scouts, 8 children ranging in age from 10 to 15, all of them familiar with the local terrain and proven capable of moving quietly through the woods. Astrid spent time with them, explaining how to recognize the approach of armed men and how to pass messages quickly without being seen. Remember, she told them, your job isn't to fight. Your job is to be our eyes and ears. If you see danger coming, you alert the adults and then you hide. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. The children nodded solemnly, understanding the importance of their role, even if they couldn't fully grasp the larger stakes of what was coming. As full darkness settled over Vargheim, Astrid found herself standing on the small rise overlooking the village, trying to see their defenses through enemy eyes. The preparations were nearly invisible in the dim light iron spikes hidden among natural brush, fire materials positioned to look like simple tool storage, escape routes marked but not obvious. To a casual observer, Vargheim would still appear to be a peaceful settlement inhabited by women, children, and old men. The deception was necessary, but it also felt fragile. Would it survive close scrutiny by experienced raiders? Would their hastily prepared defenses hold up under actual combat conditions? Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching across the grass. She turned to see Elder Bjorn climbing slowly toward her position, his walking stick tapping against stones. Unable to sleep either? He asked, settling beside her on a convenient boulder. Too much to think about, she admitted. Too many variables we can't control. I've been thinking about variables too, Bjorn said, gazing out toward the dark fjord. Specifically about you. Astrid glanced at him curiously. What do you mean? When the elders arranged your marriage to Eirik, we saw only what we expected to see. a gentle girl who needed protection, someone who could bear children and tend a household. We thought we were giving Eirik a burden he would learn to manage. The old man's words stung, even though Astrid had suspected as much. And now? Now I realized we were the ones who couldn't see properly. Bjorn's weathered hand gestured toward the village below, where the sounds of quiet preparation continued despite the late hour. Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice or the strongest arm. It's about seeing solutions others miss and convincing them to trust your vision. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the stars emerge from behind the evening clouds. The air carried the scent of pine and salt water, familiar smells that might be among the last peaceful moments they would experience for some time. "There's something else we need to discuss," Astrid said finally. "What happens if I'm wrong? If the tactics fail, or if I've misjudged Grimner's capabilities? Then we die as free people rather than as slaves," Bjorn replied matter-of-factly. "There are worse fates. But the children will have had a chance to live with dignity, even if briefly. You cannot protect everyone from every outcome, Astrid. All you can do is give them the best chance possible under the circumstances." She knew he was right, but the weight of responsibility still felt overwhelming. Every decision she made in the coming hours could mean the difference between life and death for people who had placed their trust in her judgment. "The forge hammer," she said suddenly, remembering something from the scrolls. "Sigurd's been using it to make spikes, but there's another application. In the saga of Eirik Bloodaxe, the defenders used heavy hammers to break enemy shields and weapons. If we position someone with blacksmithing strength at the right choke points, Sigrid would volunteer for that role," one said immediately. "She's angry enough at the situation to put her full strength behind every blow." Astrid nodded, already visualizing how that could work within their defensive plan. The beauty of their approach was its flexibility. Each element could serve multiple purposes, adapting to whatever the raiders actually did rather than depending on rigid predictions of enemy behavior. According to whatever the raiders actually did rather than depending on rigid predictions of enemy behavior. According to whatever the raider predictions of enemy behavior. Distant sound caught her attention. The soft hoot of an owl, but with a rhythm that wasn't quite natural. One of Olaf's scouts signaling from the eastern approach. 3 hoots, a pause, then 2 more. The code they'd established for movement detected, but not immediate danger. "They're closer than we hoped," Astrid said, standing quickly. "We need to finish the preparations tonight." As they made their way back toward the village, she felt the last remnants of her old self falling away like shed skin. The quiet healer who had limped through Vargheim's daily routines was transforming into someone she barely recognized, someone who could make life and death decisions without flinching, who could see tactics where others saw only chaos. The forge hammer would indeed play a crucial role in tomorrow's defense, but not just as a weapon. It would be a symbol of how ordinary tools could become extraordinary when wielded with purpose and determination by dawn. Grimner Iron Fist would discover that Vargheim's greatest weakness, its lack of traditional warriors, was also its greatest strength. Because sometimes the most effective fighters were those who had never been taught the proper way to lose. The first gray line of dawn found Astrid standing atop the Ravenstone, the ancient marker that crowned Vargheim's highest point. From here, she could see the entire valley spread below, the village with its carefully disguised preparations, the winding stream that Magnus had successfully diverted during the night, and most importantly, the eastern pass where their enemies would soon appear. The carved stone beneath her feet bore runic inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of weather, but she could still make out fragments of the old words. Strength in wisdom, victory through cunning. The ancient Vikings who had placed this marker understood something that Grimner Iron Fist apparently did not, that the loudest roar did not always belong to the most dangerous predator below in the village. The final preparations were nearly complete. Sigrid had worked through the night, producing nearly 60 iron spikes that now lay hidden among natural obstacles throughout the settlement. The forge hammer that had shaped them rested within easy reach of the blacksmith's shop, positioned where it could serve as both tool and weapon when the time came. Young Olaf approached up the winding path, moving with the quiet efficiency he'd developed over the past day of intensive training. His face was flushed with excitement and barely contained fear, the expression of a child who understood the gravity of their situation, but remained eager to prove himself. "Message from Magnus," he reported in a whisper. The stream diversion worked perfectly. The flooding looks completely natural, and it's forced the main camping area underwater. Anyone approaching from the east will have to use the higher ground. "Exactly where we want them," Astrid replied, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. The tactical advantage was building piece by piece, each element designed to funnel their enemies into positions where superior numbers would become a liability rather than an asset. "There's something else," Olaf continued, his voice dropping even lower. "One of the other scouts thinks she saw movement on the far ridge. Not raiders, someone trying to stay hidden and watch the village." Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Advanced scouts meant Grimner was being more cautious than she'd hoped. It also meant their window for final preparations was rapidly closing. "Tell Magnus to pull back his people immediately," she instructed. "No one should be visible near the stream or the defensive positions. We need to maintain the illusion that we're unaware of the approaching threat." As Olaf disappeared back down the path, Astrid turned her attention to the command structure they'd hastily assembled. The beauty of their plan lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. Each defender had a specific role that played to their individual strengths, and the overall strategy could adapt to whatever Grimner actually did rather than depending on rigid predictions. Elderborn would coordinate the fire barriers from his position near the village center. His decades of leadership experience made him invaluable for maintaining order when chaos erupted. Sigrid controlled the forge area and the northern approach, her strength with hammer and metal making her a formidable opponent in close combat. Magnus, despite his illness, supervised the streamside positions where his knowledge of local geography was crucial. The children served as messengers and scouts, their small size and familiarity with hiding places making them nearly invisible when they needed to be. The other women were positioned throughout the village, each responsible for specific fire points or weapon caches that could be activated quickly when needed. But the real key to their defense wasn't any single element. It was the way all the pieces worked together to create an impression that was both more and less than the reality. Grimner would see a vulnerable village defended by a handful of frightened civilians. He wouldn't see the carefully planned killing field they were walking into. Astrid made her way down from the Raven Stone, checking each position one final time. At the forge, she found Sigrid testing the balance of her hammer, swinging the heavy tool through practice arcs that would crush bone and metal with equal efficiency. "How many of them do you think will actually make it to close combat?" Sigrid asked without looking up from her preparations. "More than I'd like, fewer than they expect," Astrid replied honestly. "Our goal isn't to kill them all, it's to make them believe the cost is too high to continue. And if they don't reach that conclusion quickly enough..." Astrid touched the healing pouch at her side, feeling the familiar comfort of the worn leather. Inside were not just medicinal herbs, but also the components for smoke bombs and irritant powders her healer's knowledge turned to martial purposes. Then we keep fighting until they do. Near the stream, she found Magnus supervising the concealment of their most important advantage, the network of hidden paths that would allow defenders to move quickly between positions while remaining invisible to attackers advancing along the obvious routes. "The beauty of this terrain," Magnus explained, pointing to what appeared to be solid brush but was actually a carefully camouflaged trail, is that it looks impassable from a distance. Raiders expecting easy access to the village center are going to find themselves channeled into areas where we can control the engagement. Astrid nodded, mentally reviewing the saga accounts that had inspired this approach. Ancient warriors had understood that the defender's greatest advantage was intimate knowledge of the battleground. Every rock, every tree, every fold in the ground could become either shelter or weapon when used by someone who truly understood the local environment. The sound of a horn echoed across the valley, 3 long blasts from the direction of the eastern pass. But this wasn't their warning horn. This was something deeper, more martial. A war horn announcing the approach of armed men who expected easy victory. Positions, Astrid called quietly, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the nearest. Defenders. The word spread quickly through their network, passed from person to person until every position was manned and ready. From her command post atop the Ravenstone, she watched as Vargheim transformed from a bustling village into what appeared to be a nearly deserted settlement. The illusion was perfect. A few visible figures moving about their daily tasks, smoke rising from hearth fires, the normal sounds of domestic life carrying on the morning breeze. Only someone who knew what to look for would notice the subtle signs of preparation, the slightly unnatural placement of certain brush piles, the way shadows seemed to move independently of their supposed sources. The fact that the visible villagers were all positioned within easy reach of cover or escape routes. Grim and Iron Fist was about to learn the difference between conquest and battle, between raiding defenseless settlements and attacking people who refused to be victims. The lessons would be expensive, and Astrid intended to make sure he paid the full price for his education. The war horn sounded again, closer now, and she could make out individual figures moving along the eastern ridge. 40 warriors, just as Kenna had reported, advancing in loose formation toward what they believed would be an easy morning's work. They were about to discover that sometimes the greatest strength lay in being underestimated by those who confused gentleness with weakness, and who had never learned to fear the quiet ones who watched, learned, and remembered everything. The raiders crested the eastern ridge like a dark wave, their weapons catching the morning sunlight in brief, deadly flashes. From her position atop the Ravenstone, Astrid counted them carefully, 38 warriors that she could see, with the possibility of more following behind or taking alternate routes. Close enough to Canute's estimate to confirm that their intelligence was accurate. Grim and Iron Fist rode at their head, a massive man whose reputation for brutality was written in the scars that covered his arms and face. Even at this distance, Astrid could see the confidence in his posture, the casual way he surveyed the village below as if he were already counting his spoils. The fire brazier beside her, an ancient ceremonial vessel that had been repurposed. For their defense sat ready with oil-soaked wood and dried grass. When lit, it would send smoke signals to coordinate their various defensive positions. But more importantly, it would begin the psychological warfare that was crucial to their strategy. Let them see what they expect to see, she murmured to herself, repeating the words that had become her mantra during the long night of preparation. Then show them what they never imagined. Below, the carefully choreographed illusion was playing out perfectly. A few women moved about their morning tasks, appearing nervous but not panicked. Children played near their homes, close enough to safety, but visible enough to suggest a population caught off guard. Elder Bjorn sat outside his longhouse, apparently absorbed in repairing a fishing net, though Astrid knew the net concealed signal cords that would trigger fire. Barriers throughout the village. The raiders paused at the edge of the flooded area where the broken beaver dam had done its work. She could see them pointing at the water, discussing alternate routes, making exactly the tactical adjustments she'd hoped they would make. The flooding was forcing them toward higher ground, toward the approaches her people could best defend. 1. Of the scouts, a lean man with the look of someone accustomed to dangerous work broke away from the main group and began moving toward the village, along a path that would bring him within range of Magnus's position. This was the moment of truth for their deception. If the scout detected their preparations, the entire plan would collapse. Astrid lit the brazier, sending up a thin column of smoke that would look like nothing more than a hearth fire to casual observers, but would signal enemy scouts approaching. To her defenders, the response was immediate, but subtle figures that had been visible moments before seemed to simply fade into the landscape, while others appeared in new positions that maintained the illusion of normal village activity. The scout advanced cautiously, clearly experienced enough to recognize potential ambush sites. But he was looking for hidden warriors, not for the kind of defense that Astrid had organized. His attention focused on obvious cover: large rocks, dense brush, the spaces between buildings where armed men might conceal themselves. He completely missed the significance of the accidentally overturned cart that would channel anyone entering the village square toward a specific narrow passage. He dismissed the piles of firewood that were actually carefully constructed fire barriers ready to be ignited. Most crucially, he failed to notice that what appeared to be routine domestic activities were actually defensive preparations being completed in plain sight. Magnus's voice drifted across the morning air, raised just loud enough for the scout to hear. "Wife, have you seen my fishing spear? I thought I left it by the stream yesterday." "Behind the woodpile, husband," came Gerda's reply. "Where you always leave it." Normal conversation between a married couple, except that fishing spear was their code for enemy in position, and behind the woodpile meant Magnus should prepare to cut off the scout's retreat when the time came. The scout spent nearly an hour moving through the village's outskirts, checking potential threats and evaluating defenses. Astrid watched him work with grudging professional respect. He was thorough, careful, and experienced. Under normal circumstances, he would have detected any conventional ambush long before it could be sprung. But these weren't normal circumstances. And this wasn't a conventional ambush. When the scout finally returned to report to Grimner, Astrid could read the conversation in their body language even at a distance. Gestures that indicated minimal defenses. Shrugs that suggested no significant threats. The casual confidence that came from finding exactly what one expected to find. Grimner's response was swift and decisive. The raiding party split into 3 groups, one to approach from the north along the stream bed, one to circle around and attack from the west, and the largest group to advance directly through the village center under Grimner's personal command. It was a textbook assault pattern designed to prevent escape and ensure maximum intimidation. It was also exactly what the Saga Scrolls had taught her to expect from warriors who relied on superior numbers and conventional tactics. The fire braziers. Smoke shifted as she added more oil-soaked materials, sending up a thicker column that would be visible throughout their defensive network. This was the signal for final preparations, the last chance for anyone to reach their assigned positions before the fighting began. Astrid descended from the Raven Stone, moving quickly along paths that would be invisible to the approaching raiders. Her destination was the village center, where she would coordinate the defense from a position that appeared vulnerable, but was actually the most protected spot in their entire network. As she moved, she could see her people making their own final adjustments. Sigrid emerged briefly from the forge, her hammer in hand and her face set in grim determination. The sight of the blacksmith's wife preparing for battle should have been absurd, woman wielding a tool against seasoned warriors. Instead, it was somehow reassuring. There was something implacable about Sigrid's expression that suggested she would not be easily defeated. Near the stream, Magnus had positioned himself where he could observe both the northern and western approaches, while remaining concealed behind what appeared to be natural brush. His knowledge of every stone and tree in the area would make him nearly impossible for the raiders to locate until he chose to reveal himself. The children had vanished so completely that even Astrid couldn't spot them, though she knew they were watching from hiding places that would keep them safe while allowing them to serve as messengers when needed. Young Olaf was somewhere among them, probably closer to the action than was strictly safe. But she trusted his judgment and his survival instincts died as she reached her command position. Astrid allowed herself one final moment to survey their preparations. The village looked peaceful, almost sleepy in the morning sunlight. There was nothing to suggest that every apparent weakness was actually a strength in disguise, that every obvious vulnerability was a carefully laid trap dot in the distance. She could hear the sound of many feet moving through brush, the quiet conversations of men who believed they were approaching an easy victory. Grimner's raiders were about to learn that appearances could be not just deceiving, but deadly. The ancient fire brazier sent up its column of smoke like an offering to the old gods. A prayer for victory, or at least for the kind of defeat that would be remembered in songs. Either way, the lesson was about to begin. The attack began with the sound Astrid had been dreading, not the clash of weapons or the shouts of charging warriors, but the low, confident laughter of men who believed they had found prey rather than opponents. Grimner's main force approached the village center with the casual swagger of wolves entering a sheepfold. They made no attempt at stealth, confident that their advanced scout's report had identified all potential threats. 25 seasoned raiders moved in loose formation, weapons ready but not raised, talking quietly among themselves about the distribution of spoils. From her concealed position near Elder Bjorn's longhouse, Astrid watched them enter the carefully prepared killing field that was Vargheim's main square. Every step they took brought them deeper into her web of hidden defenses, but something felt wrong. Their movements were too confident, too casual, as if they knew something she didn't. Then she saw a flash of red cloth tied to the belt of one of the raiders near the back of the group. Not the drab browns and greens favored by men trying to move undetected through forest, but a bright crimson that served no practical purpose except identification. Her blood went cold as understanding crashed over her like a wave. She knew that cloth, had seen it many times in the village market. It was a piece of fabric from Runa's loom, distinctive in its weave and color. There was only one way a raider could have acquired it. Someone in Vargheim had given it to them. The implications struck her like physical blows. The scout's reconnaissance hadn't been as successful as she'd thought. It had been supplemented by inside information. Grimner's confidence wasn't based on what his man had observed, but on what someone had told him about their defenses. But who? And more importantly, what had they revealed? Astrid's mind raced through the possibilities as she watched the raiders spread out through the village center. Runa herself was positioned with the other women, apparently preparing to trigger fire. Barriers when the signal came. Could she be the traitor? Or had someone else gained access to her distinctive cloth? The answer came when she spotted a second piece of evidence that made her stomach lurch. One of the raiders carried a small leather pouch at his belt, not unusual in itself, except that this pouch was decorated with the same pattern of carved spirals that marked Elder Bjorn's personal belongings. Bjorn, who had access to all their plans. Bjorn, who had positioned himself at the center of their communication network. Bjorn, who had been so quick to support her unconventional strategy when others had shown skepticism. The old man sat outside his longhouse, not far from her position, still working on the fishing net that concealed their signal system. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed, an elderly villager going about his normal morning routine. But now Astrid saw his actions through new eyes. The net he was repairing would indeed trigger fire barriers when pulled. But what if those barriers were positioned to trap defenders rather than attackers? What if the signals she'd been sending were being intercepted and modified before reaching their intended recipients? A terrible possibility occurred to her What if this entire attack was designed not just to capture the village, but to eliminate the one person who might eventually pose a threat to Grimner's rule? What if she had been maneuvered into a position where her own tactical skills would ensure her destruction? She needed to warn the others, but any overt action would reveal her discovery to Bion, assuming he was indeed the traitor. Instead, she began moving carefully towards Sigurd's position, using the concealed paths they prepared for exactly this purpose. As she moved, she could see Grimner's plan unfolding with deadly precision. The northern group had encountered the stream defenses exactly as expected, but instead of being channeled toward defensive positions, they were being guided toward areas where Magnus and his people would be isolated and overwhelmed. The western group was advancing along routes that should have been blocked but seemed mysteriously clear. Most ominously, she could see movement in the hills above the village, additional raiders who shouldn't have existed according to Knut's intelligence. Either the scout had been wrong about their numbers, or reinforcements had arrived during the night. In either case, the defenders were facing a much larger force than they'd prepared for. Astrid reached the forge area to find Sigrid preparing for battle with grim determination. Her hammer ready and her position well chosen for the defense stayed planned. But the blacksmith's wife looked up with surprise as Astrid approached from an unexpected direction. "Change of plans," Astrid said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of approaching raiders. "We've been betrayed. Some of our preparations have been compromised." Sigurd's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Who?" "I think Elderborn, but I'm not certain." "What I am certain of is that Grimner knows more about our defenses than he should." The sound of splintering wood echoed across the village as the raiders kicked in the door of Magnus's house. Either the old fisherman hadn't received the warning signals, or those signals had been deliberately delayed. Shouts and the clash of weapons suggested he was putting up a fight, but against multiple opponents, the outcome was inevitable. "What do you need?" Sigrid asked, her practical nature cutting straight to the heart of the crisis. "Adaptability," Astrid replied. "Everything we planned is still viable, but we have to assume the enemy knows about our major preparations. We need to rely on the things only you and I know about." From the village center came the sound of Grimner's voice, raised in the commanding tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "People of Vargheim, your defenses have been revealed to us. Your positions are known. Surrender now, and you will be treated with the consideration due to those who submit gracefully." It was a lie, of course. Grimner's reputation for mercy was non-existent, and his definition of graceful submission typically involved slavery or death. But it was also a tactical statement. He was announcing that their secrets had been exposed, trying to demoralize the defenders before the real fighting began. "The fire barriers?" Sigrid asked, compromised. "The signal system too. But he doesn't know about the individual caches we prepared as backup." Astrid's mind was working frantically, trying to salvage their strategy from the wreckage of betrayal. "And he can't know about the things we never shared with anyone else." The Blood Eagle banner that she'd spotted earlier made more sense now. This wasn't just a raid or even a conquest. It was a deliberate campaign to establish permanent control over the region. Grimner intended to make Vargheim his base of operations, which meant he needed to eliminate not just the current defenders, but anyone who might inspire future resistance. He's going to want to make an example, she realized aloud. Public executions, probably, starting with anyone who showed leadership during the defense. "Then we don't give him the chance," Sigrid said, hefting her hammer with obvious intent. "But what about the others? Magnus, the children, the women at the barrier positions?" Astrid closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Save those she could, or risk everything in an attempt to save everyone. Accept tactical defeat to preserve strategic hope, or fight to the last person standing. When she opened her eyes again, her expression held a determination that surprised even her. We change the entire nature of the engagement. Instead of fighting the battle he expects, we give him a different battle entirely. Meaning? Meaning we stop trying to defend the village and start trying to destroy his army. The distinction was crucial. Defense implied protecting fixed positions and preserving resources. Destruction meant accepting losses in exchange for inflicting greater losses on the enemy. It was a choice between saving buildings and saving people, between tactical caution and strategic aggression. From their position, they could see Elder Bjorn finally abandoning his pretense of working on the fishing net. The old man stood and walked openly toward Grimner's position, moving with the confidence of someone who knew he would be welcomed rather than attacked. The betrayal was confirmed, but understanding it also provided opportunity. Bjorn knew their original plans, but he didn't know how those plans were about to change. Grimner was expecting a defensive battle fought according to conventional tactics. He was about to get something very different. The healing circle stones had witnessed countless moments of life and death over the generations' bursts, assisted by skilled midwives. Fevers broken through careful tending, wounds cleaned and bound with gentle hands. Now they would serve a different purpose, the one that was perhaps not so different after all. Healing and fighting both required the courage to face pain in service of something greater. Astrid stood among the ancient stones, no longer the quiet woman who had limped through village routines just days before. The transformation was complete, not just in her mind, but in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way others looked at her. Even Sigrid, who had known her the longest, watched her with something approaching awe. "Listen carefully," Astrid said to the small group that had managed to reach the rally point despite the chaos engulfing the village. "Everything we planned before is now worthless. Bjorn's betrayal means Grimner knows our positions, our signals, our intended tactics." The faces around her showed fear, anger, and confusion in equal measure. Runa clutched young Olaf protectively, her eyes red with tears for her husband Magnus, who hadn't been seen since the raiders breached his position. Two of the older women bore fresh wounds from their retreat through compromised defensive lines. Even the children looked older than they had that morning, aged by the sudden understanding that the adults they trusted weren't always able to protect them. "Then we've lost," said Gerda, Magnus's wife, her voice hollow with grief and exhaustion. "If they know our plans, if they've taken our positions." No. The word came out sharper than Astrid intended, cutting through the despair like a blade. "We've lost the battle we were trying to fight. That doesn't mean we've lost the war." She moved to the center of the stone circle, a walking stick, her father's carved shepherd's staff, planted firmly in the earth before her. The familiar weight of the carved wood in her hands was comforting, a connection to the man who had taught her that strength came in many forms. "Grimner is fighting the battle he understands," she continued. "Overwhelming force, conventional. Tactics, victory through superior numbers and equipment. He's winning that battle because he's better at it than we are." Thunder rumbled overhead as storm clouds gathered weather that had been building all morning and now threatened to complicate everything. But as Astrid looked up at the darkening sky, she saw opportunity rather than obstacle. "So we stop fighting his battle and start fighting ours." She traced patterns in the dirt with her staff, not the careful defensive positions they'd planned before, but something entirely different. What do we know that he doesn't? What advantages do we have that can't be betrayed or compromised? Young Olaf raised his hand tentatively. "We know all the secret places. The caves, the hidden paths, the places where you can see but not be seen." "Good. What else?" "The weather," offered Runa, glancing at the approaching storm. "We know how. The rain affects the terrain, which areas flood first, where the footing becomes treacherous." "Excellent. More?" "The animals," said one of the older children. "The village dogs, the horses, even the chickens. They know us, but they don't know. The raiders. Astrid nodded approvingly. You're all thinking correctly now. What about resources? What do we have access to that Grimner doesn't know about or can't easily counter? Sigrid hefted her forge hammer thoughtfully. Every tool in every workshop. Not just weapons, hammers, axes, even cooking knives become deadly in the right hands. And fire, added Gerda with sudden vicious satisfaction. They may know about our planned fire barriers, but they don't know about every pot of oil, every pile of kindling, every piece of cloth that can be soaked and lit. The despair was beginning to lift, replaced by something more dangerous hope tempered by anger, determination sharpened by the desire for revenge. Astrid could see it in their faces, the moment when victims decided to become fighters. Here's what we're going to do, she said, her voice carrying across the stone circle with quiet authority. We're going to give Grimner exactly what he's not expecting, a battle where all his advantages become disadvantages. She began assigning new roles, but these weren't the defensive positions they'd originally planned. Instead, she was creating small mobile groups that could strike quickly and disappear, teams that could operate independently, but coordinate their actions for maximum effect. Sigrid, you take the northern group. Your job isn't to hold territory, it's to make them afraid, to advance. Hit them hard, then vanish before they can respond. Make them understand that every step forward costs them dearly. The blacksmith's wife nodded grimly. How many casualties should I aim for? As many as possible without losing any of our people. Their morale is just as important a target as their numbers. Runa, you lead the children and the older women. Your mission is intelligence and harassment. You know every hiding place, every way to move unseen. I want you to be ghosts, everywhere and nowhere, watching and reporting, making them paranoid about what they can't see. What about the wounded? Runa asked, glancing at the women who had been hurt in the initial retreat. They come with me? I have a special job for people who look too injured to be threats. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The weather was going to make visibility worse for everyone, but it would also muffle sounds, confuse scents, and turn familiar ground treacherous for those who didn't know it intimately. The storm is our ally, Astrid continued. Grimmer's men are used to fighting in clear weather on known ground. Rain, mud, and limited visibility favor the side that knows the terrain better. She paused, looking each person in the eye to ensure they understood the gravity of what she was about to say. This isn't the kind of battle where we try to minimize casualties. This is the kind of battle where we accept risks in order to inflict maximum damage on our enemies. Some of us might not survive, but if we succeed, Grimner will learn that Vargheim is too expensive to hold. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the stones and turning the earth beneath their feet soft and slippery. In the distance, they could hear shouts and the crash of splintering wood as the raiders continued their systematic destruction of the village. One more thing, Astrid added, raising her voice slightly to carry over the increasing noise of the storm. Bjorn's betrayal tells us something important about Grimner's long-term plans. This isn't just a raid. It's the beginning of a campaign to control this entire region. If we let him succeed here, he'll use Vargheim as a base to attack other settlements. The implications were clear. They weren't just fighting for their own lives and freedom, but for the survival of everyone in the surrounding area. The weight of that responsibility was both crushing and liberating crushing, because the stakes were so high. Liberating because it meant they were justified in taking whatever actions were necessary. When do we begin? Sigrid asked. Astrid looked up at the storm clouds, feeling raindrops mix with the tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Tears for Magnus, probably dead in his house by the fjord. Tears for the village that would never be the same, regardless of who won this battle. Tears for the quiet life she was leaving behind forever. "We begin now," she said, gripping her father's staff more tightly. "Before the rain gets heavy enough to limit movement, while Grimner's people are still celebrating their easy victory." As the groups dispersed to their assigned tasks, moving quickly through the rain-slicked paths that led away from the stone circle, Astrid remained alone among the healing stones. She had one final preparation to make, not tactical or strategic, but personal. From her healing pouch, she removed the components for a different kind of medicine. Not herbs to heal wounds or ease pain, but substances that could confuse, disorient, or incapacitate. Mixed correctly and delivered properly, they could turn a warrior's greatest strengths, aggression, confidence, physical coordination, into fatal weaknesses. The ancient stones watched silently as she worked, preparing doses that would transform her from healer to something else entirely. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to use her knowledge of life to become an expert in death. When she was finished, she stood and faced the direction of the village center, where Grimner Iron Fist was probably receiving reports of his easy victory. The rain was falling steadily now, turning the world gray and uncertain. Perfect conditions for the kind of warfare she was about to unleash. "You wanted Vargheim," she said quietly, her words carried away by wind and rain. Let's see how much you're willing to pay for it." The first strike came not with the clash of steel on steel, but with the soft thud of a hammer meeting flesh in the rain-soaked darkness behind the forge. Sigurd's voice didn't rise above a whisper as she dragged the unconscious raider into the shadows, but her message was clear. The real battle had begun. Astrid moved through the storm like a ghost, made of mist and purpose, her father's shepherd's staff steady in her hands despite the treacherous footing. The carved wood had guided sheep through mountain passes for decades. Now it guided her through a different kind of wilderness, one where every shadow might hide death and every sound could mean discovery. The rain had transformed Vargheim into an alien landscape. Familiar paths had become streams, solid ground had turned to mud that could betray the unwary, and the constant drumming of water on wood and stone masked the sounds that careful listeners used to stay alive. For Grimner's raiders, accustomed to clear skies and certain footing, it was a hostile environment that negated many of their advantages. For the village defenders, it was home. Astrid reached her first objective, the grain storehouse, where 3 raiders had taken shelter from the storm while they inventoried their spoils. Through the partially open door, she could see them crouched around a small fire, their weapons set casually aside as they examined looted silver and discussed the division of their prizes. They were relaxed, confident, already thinking like conquerors rather than soldiers in hostile territory. That confidence was about to cost them dearly. She withdrew one of her prepared compounds from the healing pouch, a mixture that would burn with acrid smoke when thrown onto hot coals, filling an enclosed space with vapor that attacked the eyes and lungs. Not lethal, but incapacitating enough to level the playing field between a limping healer and 3 seasoned warriors. The throw had to be perfect. Too short, and the compound would miss the fire entirely. Too long, and it would overshoot and alert them before taking effect. She drew back her arm, feeling the familiar weight distribution that came from years of accurately tossing herb bundles into cooking pots, and let the packet fly. It landed directly in the center of their fire. The reaction was immediate and violent. Thick, choking smoke billowed up from the flames, and the raiders began coughing and cursing as their eyes streamed with tears. They stumbled toward the door, gasping for clean air, their hands fumbling for weapons. They could no longer see clearly. Astrid was waiting. The first raider emerged from the storehouse, bent double with coughing, his hands pressed against his streaming eyes. Her staff caught him across the temple with a crack that spoke of solid wood meeting solid bone, and he dropped without a sound. The second man came out with his sword drawn but swinging blindly, his vision too compromised for accurate targeting. She sidestepped his clumsy thrust and brought the iron-shod tip of her staff up under his chin. The impact lifted him off his feet before he crashed backward into the mud. The third raider had learned from his companion's fate. Instead of rushing blindly into the storm, he stayed inside the storehouse and shouted for help, his voice carrying across the village despite the rain. Within moments, answering calls echoed from multiple directions as other raiders responded. To his alarm, Astrid melted back into the storm, leaving behind 3 enemies who would not be participating in further combat. But more importantly, she had achieved her primary objective, forcing them to realize that their easy victory was becoming something else entirely. From the direction of the forge came the sound of Sigurd's hammer ringing against metal, but the rhythm was wrong for blacksmithing. Each blow was followed by a cry of pain or anger, suggesting that the blacksmith's wife was using her tools for their new purpose. With characteristic efficiency near the northern edge of the village, a different kind of chaos was erupting. Runa's group had managed to stampede the raiders' horses, and the terrified animals were crashing through the settlement, adding to the confusion and making organized movement nearly impossible for men trying to coordinate on foot. The psychological effect was exactly what Astrid had hoped for. Grimnir's perfectly planned assault was disintegrating into a series of isolated skirmishes where superior numbers provided no advantage. His men were being forced to fight as individuals, rather than as a coordinated unit, and individuals could be defeated by opponents who knew the terrain better. But the real test was still coming. Through the rain, she could see torches moving in the village center, a concentration of light that suggested Grimnir himself was rallying his remaining forces for a decisive push. The raid leader had realized that his scattered approach was failing, and he was adapting by consolidating his strength. It was exactly the response she'd been counting on. Astrid gripped her staff more tightly and began moving toward the village center, where the final phase of the battle would be decided. Behind her, the sounds of combat continued as Sigurd and Runa's groups maintained their harassment campaign. But ahead lay the ultimate test of her transformation from village healer to something that even she didn't fully understand yet. The shepherd's staff that had once guided her father's flock through safe paths was about to guide her into the most dangerous ground of all, a direct confrontation with a man whose reputation for violence had made him feared throughout the region. But reputations were built on past victories, and the past was about to meet a future that Grimnir Iron Fist had never imagined possible. Grimnir Iron Fist stood in the village center like a bear surrounded by wolves, his massive frame visible even through the rain-darkened air. Around him, the remnants of his raiding party had formed a defensive circle, their earlier confidence replaced by the wary alertness of predators who had discovered they were being hunted. The victory horn that should have announced their conquest lay silent at Grimnir's feet, its brass surface dulled by rain and splattered with mud. Instead of celebrating their easy triumph, the raiders found themselves counting losses and watching shadows for enemies they couldn't see coming. Astrid approached through the storm, her movement careful but not concealed. She wanted Grimnir to see her coming, wanted him to understand exactly who had transformed his simple raid into a nightmare of ambush and attrition. "You," Grimnir called when she came within speaking distance, his voice carrying clearly despite the weather. "The crippled healer, I should have known." She stopped just outside the reach of thrown weapons, her father's staff planted firmly in the mud before her. In the torchlight, she could see the full extent of what her tactics had accomplished. Of the 40 warriors who had approached Vargheim that morning, fewer than 20 remained in fighting condition. The others were dead, wounded, or simply missing in the maze of mud and rain that the village had become. "Elder Bjorn told me about you," Grimnir continued, his tone mixing respect with anger. "Said you were the one to watch, the one who might cause problems if left alive. I should have listened more carefully." You should have stayed away entirely, Astrid replied, her voice carrying across the space between them with surprising strength. Vargheim doesn't belong to you. Grimner's laugh was harsh and humorless. Everything belongs to those strong enough to take it, girl. That's the way of the world. Then you don't understand the world as well as you think. She raised her staff, not in challenge, but in signal. The sound that answered her, the deep, resonant note of the warning horn blown from the direction of the eastern pass, made every raider in the circle freeze with sudden understanding. Eirik and the hunting party had returned. The horn's call echoed off the hills surrounding Vargheim, and within moments it was answered by other horns from different directions. Not just the hunters, but warriors from neighboring settlements who had seen the smoke and heard the sounds of battle. The network of alliances that bound the coastal communities together was responding to the threat that Grimner represented. Impossible, one of the raiders breathed. The hunt was supposed to last for days. The hunt was never real, Astrid said, understanding finally dawning in her voice. Eirik suspected something like this might happen. The hunting party was actually a war party, positioned where they could respond quickly to threats. Grimner's face darkened with rage as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. Bjorn told you what we wanted him to tell you, Astrid interrupted. Did you really think we'd trust our most important secrets to one man? Even Elder Bjorn only knew part of our preparations. The trap had been elaborate and layered, designed to work whether or not there was a traitor in their midst. Bjorn's betrayal had been anticipated, not specifically, but as a possibility that required contingency planning. The real defenses had been prepared by people he'd never been told about, using resources he'd never known existed. Through the rain, the sounds of approaching warriors grew louder. Boots splashing through puddles, the rattle of weapons and armor, voices calling challenges and passwords that identified friend from foe. Grimner's remaining men began looking toward the edges of the village with the growing panic of trapped animals. You have a choice, Astrid said, her voice cutting through their rising fear. Surrender now, and you'll be treated according to the old laws. Keep fighting, and you'll learn what happens when you threaten the homes and families of people who refuse to be victims. I don't surrender to cripples, Grimner snarled, raising his war axe. If I'm going to die, I'll take you with me. He charged through the mud and rain with the desperate fury of a cornered predator, his massive weapon sweeping toward Astrid's head in an arc that would have split her skull if it had connected. Instead, it met the iron-shod tip of her father's shepherd's staff, raised at precisely the right angle to deflect the blow while redirecting its force back toward her attacker. The technique was ancient, described in the saga scrolls as a way for smaller defenders to use an enemy's strength against them. Grimner's own momentum carried him past her guard, and she pivoted smoothly despite her limp, bringing the staff around. In a strike that caught him behind the knee, the raid leader stumbled and fell face first into the mud, his axe flying from his grasp to land several feet away. Before he could recover, the sharp point of Astrid's staff was pressed against his throat, held steady by hands that showed no trembling despite everything she had endured. I said you had a choice, she repeated quietly. You chose poorly. The victory horn finally sounded, not blown by raiders celebrating conquest, but by returning warriors announcing the liberation of their home. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Vargheim washed clean and gleaming in the pale afternoon sunlight. Steam rose from wet wooden walls and muddy pathways, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that seemed to mark the boundary between the old world and whatever was coming next. Eirik stood at the edge of the village center, staring at his wife, with an expression that mixed awe, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of real recognition. The woman holding Grimner Iron Fist at spear point bore little resemblance to the quiet healer he had married 3 moons ago. Yet she was unmistakably the same person, transformed by necessity into someone he was only now beginning to understand. "Astrid," he said finally, his voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the assembled warriors and villagers. There was a question in that single word, but also an acknowledgement of something fundamental that had changed between them. She looked up from her captive, her grip on the shepherd's staff steady and sure. "Oh, husband," she replied, and despite everything that had happened, there was warmth in her voice. "Your timing was excellent." Around them, the aftermath of battle was taking shape with surprising order. Sigrid emerged from the forge area, her hammer still in her hands and her face bearing the grim satisfaction of someone who had settled old scores. Runa appeared from the northern approaches with her young scouts, all of them muddy and exhausted but triumphantly alive. The cost had been significant but not catastrophic. Magnus was indeed dead, killed in the initial assault on his position, but he had taken 3 raiders with him before falling. 2 of the older women had sustained injuries that would require careful healing, and several of the men who had tried to hold defensive positions had wounds that spoke of fierce fighting. But Vargheim itself still stood, its people still free, and Grimner's reputation for invincibility lay as shattered as his dreams of easy conquest. Elder Bruin sat apart from the celebration, his hands bound and his face bearing the hollow expression of someone who had gambled everything and lost. The motivations for his betrayal were still unclear, perhaps resentment over perceived slights, perhaps promises of wealth or position in Grimner's new order. In the end, the reasons mattered less than the consequences. "What do we do with them?" Eirik asked, gesturing toward the captured raiders. The survivors of Grimner's band sat in a guarded cluster, their earlier arrogance replaced by the dejected resignation of defeated men facing uncertain fates. Astrid considered the question carefully. The traditional response would be execution or slavery, but she found herself thinking beyond tradition to the broader implications of their actions. Word of this battle would spread throughout the region, carrying with it lessons that might prevent future conflicts. "We let them go," she said finally, her words causing murmurs of surprise from both sides of the conflict. "All of them?" Sigrid demanded, her hammer still ready for further work. "After what they've done?" "All except Grimner himself," Astrid clarified. "But they go with a message. They tell everyone they meet what happened here, how a defenseless village turned into a trap, how 40 seasoned warriors were defeated by women, children, and old men who refused to be victims." She could see understanding dawning in Eirik's eyes. "You're thinking tactically even now, making our victory serve a larger purpose. Fear can be a weapon," she agreed. "If other raiders believe Vargheim is too dangerous to attack, we won't have to fight these battles repeatedly. Sometimes the most effective victory is the one that prevents future wars." The unity braid she had begun weaving during the battle was taking shape in her. Hand strands of hair donated by families throughout the village, twisted together into something stronger than any individual strand could be alone. It was a physical representation of what they had accomplished, but also a promise of what they could achieve in the future. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the fjord in shades of gold and crimson, the village gathered in the center for a meal that served as both celebration and memorial. The food was simple bread, cheese, preserved meat, and ale, but it tasted like victory after the day they had endured. Eirik sat beside his wife for the first time since their wedding, not because tradition demanded it, but because he chose to. The awkward distance that had characterized their marriage seemed to have evaporated along with the morning's rain. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, speaking just for her ears amid the larger conversation flowing around them. "For what? For not seeing you clearly. For thinking that gentleness meant weakness, that quiet meant simple, that being different meant being lesser." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "I was wrong about many things." Astrid touched the unity braid at her belt, feeling the different textures of hair from young and old, from those born in Vargheim and those who had come from elsewhere to make it home. "We were both learning," she said. "Perhaps we can continue learning together." The suggestion held promise that went far beyond their personal relationship. The village had discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed, had found strength in cooperation rather than just individual prowess. The lessons learned today would reshape how they approached not just defense, but community life itself. Young Olaf approached their table, still glowing with the pride of having served as a crucial messenger during the battle. "What happens now?" he asked. "Will there be more raids?" "There will always be challenges," Astrid replied, but her voice carried confidence rather than worry. "The difference is that now we know how to face them, not as victims hoping for rescue, but as people who understand that our greatest strength comes from working together." She looked around the gathering, at Sigrid sharing battle stories with warriors who now treated her as an equal, at Runa's organizing the children who had proven themselves as capable scouts and messengers, at neighbors who had discovered depths of courage and resourcefulness they hadn't known they possessed. The marriage blade still hung on the wall of her longhouse, but it no longer seemed like a symbol of separation between two different ways of life. Instead, it had become a reminder that strength could be found in many forms, that the most powerful bonds were forged not in ceremony, but in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual respect. Vargheim was still the same village it had been that morning, built along the same fjord and populated by the same people. But everything had changed anyway, in ways that would echo through generations yet to come. Sometimes, the person everyone underestimated really was the one who saved them all.